So there's a little bit of an idea that rights, rights. One of the problems with rights theory is that rights oftentimes will bump up against each other. Okay, and the idea here is that rights oftentimes bump up against each other. And so, for example, my right to, I should have a right to free speech, but what if my speech offends you? Do you have a right not to be offended? Well, that's a good question, and especially on a lot of college campuses, that's an issue where conservatives oftentimes, are complaining nowadays, and legitimately so, that liberal campuses will oftentimes refuse to let conservative speakers like Ann Coulter come to Stanford and other places because they have an issue with their politics, and so where does her right to speak end? And the right of the Republican students on that campus to invite a guest like Ann Coulter to come and speak, and then the rights of those individuals who live there on that campus who are now saying, well, it's creating a hostile environment, and I feel harmed, and I feel like Ann Coulter is intentionally vitriolic. Ann Coulter is intentionally tries to make people mad. That's how she makes her money, and I don't think Ann Coulter would even argue that point. Ann Coulter is one of those that I think a lot of liberals read just because they like to be ticked off by her, and I think a lot of Republicans read because they like the fact that she's ticking off liberals. I don't know. And so, your right to go around your campus and not have to worry about, feeling like there's somebody who you find their speech to be hateful and dislikeful. Where does that end, and where does the right of her to speak there as a guest of the Republican Students Organization begin and end? And so one of the issues is rights bump up against each other. And so there's a little idea of how do you balance those rights out? How do you handle rights? How do you do that? And there's two concepts that come up, and one of them is infringing upon rights and inflating rights. Now, these are concepts of infringing upon rights is when you limit the rights of one person in order to benefit those of another. And inflating rights is when you increase the rights of an individual or one person and it ends up harming others. Now, the way this is framed is against government or against entities, because we typically would think you inflate the rights of the individual, and then that hurts the government. It's kind of like a teeter-totter. The rights of the individual go up, and the rights of the government go down. And when the rights of the individual go down, the rights of the government go up. It's easier for the government to function if you limit the rights of the people. It's easier to collect taxes and levy things. It's easier to do things. Like if the police, mainly in a police power issue, if you don't give people the rights to, if you take away the rights to a warrant, if you give the police warrantless wire searches or warrantless home search opportunities, that will give them a great advantage. It will give them a great advantage in law enforcement, but at the same time, the individual will be nervous and skeptical, and they can have their home looked through anytime they want, and that infringes upon your rights. You might say, well, what if you don't do anything wrong? Well, that's a little bit of a hard thing to say, especially for people who oftentimes may not have ever experienced police force or police power in a negative way. I used to work, for example, in at night in not the best of neighborhoods. I worked at a newspaper for years, and I would say, it was in downtown Decatur, and I would say that in order to get to my home, I had to drive through the less than great neighborhoods at 1 a.m. And a lot of times I would get pulled over, and the police would come up, and they'd kind of be like, where are you going? And they'd look, and I'd be like, I'm just going home from work. And as soon as they realized I was going home from work, they'd be like, oh, okay. And they'd make the whole decision, the whole thing would be expedited, right? But the case is that I can tell you that I would say that happened to me at least, at least once a year, okay? And I worked there for 7 or 8. So 7 or 8 times I've been pulled over at 1 a.m. for absolutely no reason. You didn't make a left-hand turn. You didn't have your left-hand turn signal on, or you kind of hit the line when you were driving down the road. Okay, no, I wasn't. But, I had a colleague one time who got pulled over for. There were left turn. There were 2 lanes in a one-way street, and one of them looped back around to the road, and the other one went into a tunnel. And so you always whenever anybody turned left on that road, they'd always go to that second lane. And the officer pulled her over and said, well, you pulled into the wrong lane. You didn't pull into the first lane and then merge right. And she said, "Are you kidding me?" And the guy's like, well, "I'm not going to write you a ticket. I just wanted to know what, we always just we see cars out at night and we just pull them over because we want to know what they're doing." Now that's a little bit of an inflating or an infringing upon the rights of the individual. Infringing is when the rights of the individual are limited in order to benefit the government. And without question, that is an appropriate use of probably police power to pull over people just to see what they're doing, right? Now it makes it a lot easier if you're looking for criminals, and I'm not suggesting they don't need to be out looking for criminals. It's probably better than them sitting and drinking coffee in their car. But I'm suggesting that, that does hurt, because now you're tired, you're in a bad mood, maybe whatever, you just got off work, it's 1 a.m, you got your kids getting up at 6 a.m, you got things going on, and the last thing you want to do is have to sit there for 15 minutes at the side of the road waiting on a cop to decide whatever, right? And so that does infringe upon your rights. So infringing is when the government increases their rights to hurt people, and inflating is when you inflate the rights of the individual, but it makes it harder for the government to do their things. And what that means is, when you set rules like warrantless, you have to have a warrant for searches. When you set rules about, people need to have attorneys, people have a right to free speech, and so the government needs to provide protection if somebody wants to give speech that they're afraid it's going to be harmful. Somebody wants to hold a KKK rally in the middle of an all African American neighborhood, things like that. You're going to need extra police protection. The idea there is that when they have those rights, that actually causes a disadvantage to the government or society because they have to bear the cost to assure that your rights are protected. So that's inflating. Infringing is when you limit the people's rights in order to help the government.